homeowners like you guys. I'm Lynn Dang, and I will be moderating today's Q&A session. And if you don't know about us already, we're Trees Atlanta, and our mission is to protect and improve Atlanta's urban forest by planting, conserving, and educating. And before we jump into the session, just some housekeeping things for like a, oh, sorry. Just some housekeeping items for the webinar in general. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and the chat button. They're right next to each other. You can use whichever one you want, but if you have any questions along the way, you can just submit those and we'll get to them and answer them live. I know you guys have already submitted questions during registration, but this is just in case. And you're very encouraged to keep asking questions. And after this Zoom webinar is over, there will be an email sent to you all with a link to a survey. And if you guys want to just take the time and answer that survey, it would help us a lot in planning our future events. It just would really help us figure out what everybody wants to see from us. So please do that. And coming up in a month, actually, we have a Wildflower watercolor workshop with a local artist named Patricia. As you can see, she painted that lovely Christmas card for us in the past. And it's just like a really great way to connect nature with art. So go to our website and our calendar of events for more information. And here's our website and all our socials, just if you're interested in other events coming up. There's like a whole list of them outside of education as well, volunteer opportunities and everything. And now introducing our two wonderful speakers, Stephanie Coffin and James Moy. And I'll pass it off to you guys for your intro.
Thanks, Lynn. I'll go first. My name is James Moy. I work for Trees Atlanta. Also, I'm the data manager currently, but I got my start working on the neighborhoods team, which is how I know Stephanie, who's one of our community contacts in Virginia Highlands. So my background, I'm ISA certified, and we'll talk a little bit more about what the International Society of Arboriculture is about later. But I'm an arborist, but most of my work has been in planting trees in public spaces. So I can speak to things like tree selection and general care and maintenance for young trees best.
Hello, my name is Stephanie Coffin, and I've been an ISA certified arborist since 1998, but I don't really work on trees, that is getting up on trees and pruning and that kind of thing, so I'm not in the business. But what I do is I work in my neighborhood, help people with tree appeals, do a lot of tree planting, and do a lot of troubleshooting for people who have problems with trees in terms of getting hold of the arborist or what to plant, that kind of thing. So it's, I call myself a tree activist and, you know, work for free. Thank you.
Thank you guys for being here again and for taking the time, and especially with all these little technical errors, but we can just get right into it. So I think I'm going to start off with all the questions that were submitted during registration. So our first question is, somebody has a root invasion on a 6-year-old bosque elms in their neighborhood, and there is potential damage to water systems and sidewalk/driveway heaving. And the community wants to remove these trees, citing future damage. How do you guys feel about that decision or just the situation in general?
Yeah,
I think
go ahead.
I'll let Stephanie speak to the stuff about permitting for tree removal and stuff. But right off the bat, bosque elms are a type of Chinese elm, which, although I do not recommend planting them if they're already 6 years old, it sounds like they're pretty well established. Generally, those are very well behaved street trees and don't pose significant risk to concrete or underground utilities. But when it comes to the actual removal of those and permitting, I think the community has probably a lot more permitting that they need to do than they realize, and Stephanie can speak to that better.
You know, it really depends upon where you live. And I am very familiar with the Atlanta Tree Protection Ordinance. And the ordinance protects all trees over 6 inches at diameter at breast height. So outside of that, you have to get a permit to take down trees. And the tree protection ordinance does not really allow trees to be taken down for potential damage. It only allows there are certain conditions that you can take down trees. But if you can't take the trees down because they're dead, dying, or hazardous, or you have a construction permit, there is something in the ordinance called a landscape permit that you can ask for trees to be cut down. I will point out that, you know, there are 2 basic jurisdictions in the city. One is trees on private property, and the other is trees on public property. And we have 2 different agencies which govern those trees and all the rules in terms of takedown. So if these trees are on private property, you have to go through the arborist department, the city arborist department, and they do. And what you would do is you would submit a landscape permit and detail what trees you want to take down, and also how you're going to replace the trees. And that's a standard procedure. You submit the application to the arborist department, and they will weigh on it and talk to you about it probably, and either reject it or accept it. Now, if these trees are sidewalk trees, you have to go through the parks department, and that's another issue. And probably you would talk to them in terms of writing them a letter and asking them what you would want to do or what you intend to do, and ask for their suggestions. If you are taking down public trees, they must be replanted inch for inch back on public property. And that's basically to protect our street canopy, which is really important. But you can find all that information on the web, either in the city arborist website or in the parks department.
And I might add, if the person who asked this question is coming from the angle of they'd like to, protect the trees, and they're, hoping for resources to, bring to the community to persuade them not to remove the trees. I mean, we're looking at the number of heat advisory days that we experience here in Atlanta in the summer doubling in the next couple of decades. And a tree like a Bosque elm, even though Chinese elms are not my favorite tree, a tree that's already 6 years old and established in the ground is much better than a sapling. That's going to provide real measurable health benefits to the people who live around those. So even if it's not pretty, even if it messes up the sidewalk a little bit, although I don't think that's going to be an issue with a particular tree, I think it's really worth bringing to those people's attention that a tree that is already this old and this well on its way to creating canopy is a very valuable resource, especially in this particular time in history. And if the community's already kind of well on its way to trying to get the trees removed, I would just make sure that they are, like Stephanie said, going through the proper channels and contacting the Office of Parks if those were in right-of-way spots, because they could get slapped with some hefty fines if they go outside of that.
Thank you. Our next question is a more general one. So what are some best practices when caring for trees on a newly purchased property?
So Stephanie suggested, when we discussed this question earlier, creating a tree inventory on the property. And I think that's a really good idea. Do you want to speak to that more, Stephanie?
Yeah, I mean, it's really great to have a new property and to take a look and see what kind of trees you have on that property. It's very exciting that you have that much interest in trees. So what I suggest you do is try and get some professional help and a small tree inventory. That is, identify the species and throw a tape around those diameters and see how big they are. And you can work off of that list, for as long as you stay at that location, where you're going to be planting new trees, and, maybe you want to fill in with some evergreens, that kind of, those kinds of issues. You also want to do this, and that is to take a look and see if you have any larger trees, and to see if they have any hazardous conditions or hazardous problems. And if you are fearful of that, you can always call, if you live in the city of Atlanta, you can always call the arborist department and get a hazard evaluation of that tree. But it's just wonderful that you have these trees, and it's wonderful that you have some interest in the trees. And I would just encourage you to find out as much as you can about them.
Yeah, I agree with Stephanie that learning the names is really powerful, because you can do a lot of your own research that way. Something I'd recommend, some small things that I notice with trees when I'm just walking around the city, especially trees that are maintained by kind of like large landscape contractors. If the property has that kind of history, I would do a walk around and look at two things. I would look at kind of the root crown area of the tree, because I hope you can see the diagram as you're here. A lot of trees that are maintained by large landscaping companies, they'll just kind of dump mulch around the base of the tree, and mulch is good. I think part of taking care of these new trees is making sure that they do have a good layer of organic material, whether that's leaf litter, wood chips, or compost around the base. But you just want to make sure that it's not piled up on the root crown here. You want to be able to see kind of the area where the trunk flares out into the roots on every tree. If that's covered up on any of the trees on your property, you might want to excavate that gently with like a soft rake or something, because you can actually end up having rot in the really critical part of the tree right there if you allow too much material to build up. So that's a common thing that we see a lot on the neighborhoods team. And another thing, while you're looking for kind of hazardous things, like Stephanie mentioned, like if you notice in the spring that like a large branch overhead doesn't have any leaves and all the other ones do, that might be a cue that you need to call an arborist, an ISA certified arborist out to come take a look at that and make sure that didn't pose any hazards. While you're doing that kind of visual assessment of your trees, you could look for things like old hardware that was put in the tree. Sometimes somebody staked the tree a long time ago to get it to go straight again, and they never took the kind of tubing or straps off that tree once the tree was straight. And if you leave that stuff on, eventually it can girdle the tree, which means as the tree gets bigger, it'll kind of constrict the flow of nutrients and water to the tree trunk. So making sure that you just know if anybody's installed anything on that tree, where that stuff is, so that you can remember to take it off as the tree grows. That can save you a lot of, save you a whole limb later down the road and save you money as well. So yeah.
So let me just add, James and I have been talking about what we call ISA certified arborists, and ISA stands for International Society of Arboriculture. And it basically is a professional organization that certifies people after a test and some education so that they are qualified to work on trees. There are a lot of people out there who just, come in with a pickup truck and a couple of pruning shears and they whack away at trees. But trees are very kind of like our bodies in some ways. You can do a lot of damage if you don't know what you're doing. So what you want to do is when you get anyone to work on your trees, go to the ISA website. You can Google it, ISA, and there is a list of people in Georgia and the Atlanta area who are certified. And I recommend that you call those people first, because they are the people who have been educated to work on trees.
Thank you. So we've just had a follow-up question. So please explain why the city of Atlanta does not do free hazard assessment, or please explain that the city of Atlanta does not do free hazard assessment on trees and that they do drive-bys only.
Well, they do free hazard trees, but they were doing drive-bys during COVID. And of course, as we all know, the city hall was closed down for more than 2 years. So what they did during that particular time is ask people to submit an application for a dead, dying, and hazardous permit, and took photographic evidence and did drive-bys, but that should be ended by now. I know that the city has hired more people. They lost people during COVID. They hired more people, and apparently that they're up and running. And so that those hazardous tree permits should be seen by someone, seen by an arborist by the city for either acceptance or rejection. And there is a hazardous tree checklist and evaluation that you can get, or you can call up your arborist and talk to them about meeting you on site so you can learn about whether the tree is hazardous and why they decide it's hazardous. All those things should be available now.
Perfect, thank you. And someone has pointed out that the website to find an ISA certified arborist is treesaregood.org, and that the ISA website does not have a directory. Is that true? But
no, that's not true. They do. And trees are good. I don't know if they're
Looks like that website is sponsored by ISA, so I think they just moved their their search tool onto that website. Trees are good. You can also use the Georgia Arborist Association's website. They're the local chapter of the ISA.
perfect. Thank you for pointing that out. Another website to use. Another website at our disposal, I guess. Moving on. So someone would like to transplant a large ligustrum shrubs to create a tall privacy hedge to replace dying leylands that were recently removed and stumps ground. Any advice?
Go ahead, James.
Yeah. So the first thing I'd say here, ligustrum is privet. We don't have any native privet. All the species of ligustrum that I've seen in Atlanta have pretty high invasive potential, whether it's Chinese privet, Japanese privet, or glossy privet. I would strongly encourage not using those. It's tempting because if you already have the plants on your property, just move them. So I understand if ultimately that is what you do, but I would strongly encourage using a native evergreen shrub. Walter's Viburnum is what we use here at the Candida Center at Trees Atlanta's headquarters. It looks just like privet. The flowers are even prettier, and you don't have the same issues of it escaping into the woods and suffocating native species. And you also don't have the issue, the berries of privet are basically have no nutrition, but they are really abundant. So a lot of birds will like gorge themselves on these berries, but won't be actually getting any nutrition out of them. Those are some of the reasons why people at Trees Atlanta and ecologists in general do not like privet. If you ever go to any of our kind of native creek spaces, for example, Sandy Creek, Peachtree Creek, in the woods behind Piedmont Park, they do a pretty good job of cleaning it up, but privet will basically choke out the entire understory anywhere near a river. So we really try to get people not to plant that. That being said, if you are kind of dead set on using these plants, the best thing to do when transplanting
Uh-oh. Is he frozen for you as well, Stephanie?
James is frozen.
Yeah. Oh no.
Let me just finish for James.
Yeah, that'd probably be
There are
productive.
so many choices that you can use besides privet. And you cannot go into any park almost in the city of Atlanta and see privet growing. And it is such a problem. I've been on crews that take out privet, but then if you don't plant something back, it just comes back over and over and over again. So you don't want to be part of the problem. It's kind of like English ivy. You don't want to plant English ivy because eventually that'll climb up the tree and kill the tree. So there are so many other choices that you can use, like James mentioned one, but the other are holly hedges. So you can go on into your, nurseries or onto the computer and try and find another choice. But whenever you plant, you don't want to plant it directly on the old stump area. Plant it to the side.
Thank you, and
Sorry
welcome
about
back,
that, guys.
James.
Can you hear me? Awesome. My computer is still frozen. I'm looking at my face. It's frozen on the other screen. I missed what Stephanie said, but to finish the thought about root pruning, if you look up instructions on how to root prune something, basically what you do is you take a long trenching shovel and you go kind of around the perimeter of a woody plant around the base of the trunk, like a foot or so out, and you drive that trenching shovel down all the way down at least a foot and a half in kind of like a circle of like 2 to 3 feet in diameter around the plant. And what that does is it severs the roots and encourages new root growth around the root ball in the center of the tree. So when you actually move that plant, the plant has more functional root in that root ball that you move, versus if you just pick the plant right out of the ground, you're going to lose a lot of the roots because a lot of the roots have moved farther away from the tree. So if you are dead set on moving these ligustrums, you can look up some information about root pruning to make sure that that transplant is successful.
Thank you. Can you provide any guidance on crowning a tree that's getting too big for a yard? For example, a magnolia tree?
So there's a little confusion here for me about what they mean by crowning. If the individual who asked that question is in the chat, I'm curious if they mean, are they trying to do a full reduction of the tree canopy, or are they just trying to remove some limbs? Because in arboriculture, you hear about canopy reduction or crown reduction, which is the selective removal of limbs. And then you hear about topping and tipping, which are highly discouraged practices of basically just chopping off parts of the tree. So
yeah, I would like to just add something. Topping means to cut the main leader of a tree. And that is illegal in the city of Atlanta, because basically what you're doing is you're short living this tree once it's cut off. And tipping is also illegal according to the Atlanta Tree Protection. That's when you just go off and you just cut the tips around, to make it a round ball or whatever. And that also is very dangerous for the tree, or hazardous for the trees, because what they'll do in that spot that's been cut is send out multiple shoots. So you're basically interfering with the basic structure of the tree. So given that, is this enforced by the city of Atlanta? Well, rarely, but what you're doing is those are practices that are considered harmful for trees. So crown reduction is a process generally that takes several years, and it's usually done by experienced tree climbers and arborists from the top as they remove select limbs. So one of the problems with this question is that there's really not enough information for us to make a positive recommendation. I will say this, I did talk to a couple other arborists, and magnolias are very tough, unlike some of our other trees, but which means that they can take pruning. But in general, pruning is basically, as our field or arboriculture learns more about trees, the word on pruning is you really should know why you're pruning and do it very carefully. So yeah, if you want to change, you want to prune your magnolia, what I would recommend is you get an experienced pruner.
So going back to the last question about the ligustrum shrubs, what was the name of the viburnum you recommended planting instead of the ligustrum?
Yeah, so what we have here at the Candida Center is a beautiful hedge of Walter's Viburnum. I think that's Viburnum obovatum or Viburnum walteri, but it's common enough that you'll see it if you Google it. We also sell it at our native plant sale and tree sale, I think. So there's 2 times a year we can get it from us. But it's a pretty common native shrub and a good permanent replacement. But any Viburnum really is a good choice.
Perfect, thank you. So there are vines encircling some old trees. What is the best way to kill the roots without using glyphosate?
I can speak to that one because I've worked with some people at Trees Atlanta who do vine removal and invasive removal pretty much 20 or all day, 9 to 5. You really don't need chemicals. If you're dealing with vines on trees, the best thing you can do is just manually sever and remove them. This works for English ivy, for wisteria, for kudzu. Basically, you just find the lowest part of the vine that you can, the part where the vine leaves the ground and climbs into the tree, and just sever it and leave. You'll make 2 cuts. So let's see if I can do a diagram. If we have like English ivy, for example, on this tree, you just want to make sure that when you make your cuts, you're leaving a good 6 inches to a foot gap between where the roots of the vine and where the vine continues up the tree, so that way it can't heal and regrow. If you just do that, you're cutting off the vine's food source because all the trees are going to be up here. So staying on top of that, you might have to pull some sprouts off the roots again, but really manual removal will serve you much better than glyphosate 9 times out of 10. If you have English ivy, you'll probably will have leaves down here as well. I usually use like a hard rake or just by hand pull those up. They come up pretty easily, but Stephanie also recommended using some sort of ground cloth to smother anything that you have on the ground.
Yeah, you use ground cloth if you have poison ivy. You do that very cautiously. I mean, that's the way I've killed poison ivy, is just to put a big sheet of plastic over it rather than to get in there and just put myself at risk by pulling off poison ivy.
Yeah, is that commenter in the chat by any chance? Do they know what kind of vines they're dealing with? Because that'll kind of determine how you deal with them.
Yes, I think something just came in. Sorry, the screen is
I see the note about not pull. Yeah, someone said don't pull ivy off once you severed it, just let it fall off by itself.
Mhm.
Yeah, it will be messy, but that's the way to do it.
Okay, perfect.
At my house, we severed like a wisteria vine that's about this big, and this is a success story because it was a wisteria vine that was about as big as a tree growing on our existing tree, and it was as easy as just making 2 cuts and taking a big chunk out. And it's been raining down little pieces of vine for the past 2 years, but the tree is looking much better.
That's good to hear. Sorry, this chat button is giving me grief. Okay, perfect. Someone asked, can you please say more about how to get rid of poison ivy that is growing up a tree?
Okay, yeah, so if it is poison ivy, what I'd recommend is get yourself a good pruning saw, something with a nice long blade. Wear gloves just for extra protection, and honestly, maybe even a face covering so that you don't get anything, as you're sawing, you don't have anything kind of splatter on you. And still, same rule applies, just make 2 cuts and remove that central chunk of the vine from, around ground level to shin height, maybe. And that the upper vines will die, and you want to be handling all that material. If you have to collect it to put it in the garbage bag, you want to be handling it all with gloves and stuff like that. But what I would do is just leave that area alone and let it decompose, and then you won't have any issues. But for ground ivy, like Stephanie said, the best thing is the drop cloth. You can also try sheet mulching, which is when you take, if you have a lot of cardboard at your disposal or like a biodegradable landscape fabric, you can lay that down. If it's cardboard, you want to make sure it overlaps really well. Just cover the entire area with cardboard and then pile 3 to 6 inches of mulch on top of that all the way around. And that's going to smother the vines. And then it actually gives you nice, rich soil to plant on top of afterward.
Thank you. Do you have any recommended treatment of a sun-scalded bare wood patch that's 4 inches wide by 30 inches tall on the south side of Chinese Pistache?
So treatment for sun scald, if it's already progressed to the point where you can see and tell that it's sun scald, really the main thing you do for the actual wound itself is just clean it. So if there's kind of flaky pieces of bark or you can see where there's rot underneath, you want to expose as much of that as possible so that there's not places for insects to live and there's not places for mold to develop. Because trees can heal their own wounds eventually, but the best way to accelerate that is to just make sure that there's not excessive moisture at the site of the wound. So I would clean off the bark as it dies. Don't actively try to scrape anything off, but it should just flake off on its own. And then just make sure that the tree is well watered and well mulched, and it'll heal itself.
Then in terms of the conditions for the sun scald, that this tree the trunk is being exposed to heavy sunlight, either in winter time or in summertime. Maybe the suggestion is to plant some buffer bushes around the tree to protect the tree from sunlight.
Thank you. Where do you recommend shopping for like a front yard in terms of like what type of business or like what type of nurseries in the area?
So depending on what you're looking for, I mean, I'm assuming here we're talking about native plants. One really great source that's woman owned and always has really cool rare plants is Garden Hood. They're on Boulevard, just at the Boulevard I-20 off ramp. And they have really great quality stuff. They have edibles, they have natives, they have really expert staff, and they even have an install team. So they come very highly recommended to me, and I've browsed their selection before and been pretty impressed. There's some things that they can't get that we do try to supply every year at our native plant sale. So you can check those out. The native plant sale is the first week of April, and then the native tree sale is the first week of October. So those are great sources as well. Beyond that, a lot of times it's hard to find specific native plants because they're mainly sold wholesale to landscapers, but you can go onto websites. I think gardenia.net has one plant finder. But if you can find the botanical name of your plant and type it in, there's a lot of websites that'll come up towards the top that will give you kind of suggestions about how to order them. One of the plants that I recommend, I often get questions about shade ground cover. One of the plants that I recommend for that is Allegheny Spurge, which is something that you kind of have to buy as like just little rootlets, and they'll just ship it to you in like a little bag. So that's a common way to get rare plants if you can't find a store around you that sells them.
Thank you. What kind of fruit trees do well in Atlanta, and when should they be planted?
So I think this goes for pretty much any tree, but the best time to plant a tree is when it doesn't have leaves, if it's deciduous, and even if it's evergreen. Really, in the winter, trees have much lower water needs, so it's the best time to plant a tree because the roots have more time to develop before they have to feed leaves, so to speak. And the best fruit trees in Atlanta, in my experience, so service berries are actually popping right now. They're kind of somewhere between a bush and a tree, but they can be trained to be a tree. Really great flavor, like blueberries. You can even plant them in the right of way and they'll do well. So I really love those because they're pretty low maintenance. They will just make the fruit on their own and you can just pick it. things like people think of peach trees as being really iconic Georgia trees, but you kind of need to be a little bit more on top of taking care of a peach tree. Other good low maintenance trees for Atlanta, I know fig trees do really well here. There are a couple of fantastic fig trees in my neighborhood that I can always get like a whole basket full from in kind of like June, July. And another neat one is pawpaw. Those can be a little bit more finicky. They like part shade, but that's the largest fruit that grows on a tree. It's native to North America. It's a lot of qualifications, but it's a really cool fruit and it doesn't keep well. So kind of the only way you can enjoy it is if you plant a tree. Those get a little bit bigger, so they also work as shade trees. And then the last one I'd recommend is Asian or American persimmon. American persimmon is kind of like a larger tree, so it also, like a pawpaw, ends up being a shade tree. But the Asian varieties stay a little bit smaller, and they produce really big, juicy fruits here. Even though they're native to Asia, they do really well here. And the only thing with those is that I see a lot of people will have to like put little protective baggies over each individual fruit because they're so tasty that the wildlife will get to them too.
I've grown pawpaws and now have many pawpaws in my yard, and have also potted up pawpaws and given them away and that kind of thing. But you have a huge competitor when you grow fruit trees. Not that I'm discouraging you, but the squirrels, man, they get every pawpaw, everything. So, whatever fruit you grow, you probably should take the next step and say, how are you going to protect that fruit if you want to eat it?
What do pawpaws taste like? I've never had one before.
It tastes like a really sweet kind of ripe banana.
Wow. I will
They
try
don't
to
sell
try
them in
one
stores.
soon.
Yeah, they don't sell them in stores, but it's pretty big in this country. So they have pawpaw festivals and they make cocktails out of pawpaws and bread out of pawpaws and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I read somewhere that I think like maybe it was Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers, used to like freeze them and kind of like eat them like ice cream because they're really custardy. They're really creamy.
That's smart. Kind of like grapes, right? People
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
use like popsicles.
A lot of things are better when frozen.
Yeah.
I forgot to mention also, for fruit trees, if you kind of want to just browse them a little bit and see what they look like, the Browns Mill Food Forest, where Trees Atlanta has done a lot of work and a lot of planting, and there's some really great community stewards there keeping, growing and conserving the plants there. They have basically every kind of fruit tree that you can grow in Atlanta planted there as an example. So you can go see how they look and see what the fruit look like at different times of the year, and that might help you make a decision.
This is also going back to the previous question, but what was the name of the ground cover for shady areas that you mentioned?
Allegheny Spurge. I remember the first week that I joined Trees Atlanta, I asked Greg, that the executive director, because he's got, a lot of years of native plant knowledge. And that was the first thing that came to mind for him. Allegheny Spurge, there's Japanese spurge, which is really common in landscape trade. It's kind of invasive. And Allegheny Spurge is a very beautiful deer resistant and native alternative to that is not as invasive. It's really happy in shade and has a little flower.
Thank you. And now to finish off with like a fun question for each of you, what's your favorite plant or tree in your own yard?
Well, I have, I just plant trees. I have a beautiful birch that's growing. I have pawpaws. I have a big leaf magnolia. So for me, it's a whole variety of trees that, are beautiful in the wintertime and bloom in the springtime and are fantastic in the summer. So I just love trees.
Yeah, I'm in a rental property. So it came with a lovely, massive post oak, which is an upland oak that you don't really see very often in Atlanta, but all along my street, we have these lovely post oaks that have like a really thick trunk that goes straight up, but then their sideways branches are kind of like almost live oaky. They like spread out really wide. So that's a really nice tree to hammock under. But the plant that I planted that I like the best, there's an example of it on the east side Beltline on the bridge above Gaskill Street. It's called Florida Sunshine Mimosa. So it's a native ground cover mimosa, and it's also called sensitive plant because the leaves will close up when you touch them. So I go out every morning and I just pop them and watch them close up, and I love that. And they also have a cute little pink powder puff flower that feeds pollinators. So that's my favorite plant in my yard.
That's awesome. How long does it take for it to close up? Is it like immediate, or is it like...
You can see it happen, yeah, like in
Wow.
a second. Although they've done studies that show that these plants actually have like a memory. They're using mimosa in a lot of scientific research to show how plants store information, because if you pop the same leaf enough times, like over weeks, it will stop responding because it realizes that you're not a threat to it. So somehow the plants can differentiate between different kinds of stimulus and know that certain things are dangerous or not. So
Wow.
yeah,
You
can
should
tell
keep doing it every day. You should keep doing it every day until it gets to know you.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Okay, so we are fresh out of questions, but kind of just in time to, or I guess someone just asked one. Let me see. Sorry, this chat is really...
I can see it.
Okay,
so
thank you.
Anonymous asked, are hornets pollinators for tomato plants? Also, if you have hornets, does this tend to keep bees away? I don't know if hornets keep bees away. They're generally not pollinators. There's some kinds of wasps that do pollinate certain plants, but generally hornets are they are pest predators. So they can be good to have around your plants because they'll protect your plants from things like hornets might protect your tomatoes from tomato hookworm, which is, I know, a really annoying pest, but they won't necessarily pollinate the flowers to my knowledge.
Yeah, in closing, I would just like to say that the trees we have in Atlanta really make Atlanta, and that everyone should be really, really conscious of how important they are, to take care of them, to mulch them, to water them, and to protect them from other people taking them down and doing the things that they should not be doing with trees. It's really the responsibility of everyone in Atlanta to take care of our trees. We do have an arborist department, but they really can't do it by themselves. So it really falls on the people who live in the city to take care of the trees.
Yeah, that's a good note, Stephanie, because it's something like 70 or 80% of our canopy is on private property. So ultimately it just comes down to your own values and your willingness to commit to keeping a tree alive. Because we used to have something like 1 billion acres of forest here in the eastern US, and Atlanta's still really good. We still have over 40% canopy coverage, but unless people really value that, that number is going to go down.
Yeah, thank you. Super well put. So someone is asking what the name of the viburnum you recommended planting instead of the ligustrum.
It was Walter's Viburnum, like Walter, like the name.
Yeah, I'll type it in the chat for you. Okay, thank you. If anyone has some last minute questions, now's the time to submit them. But yeah, thank you so much again, Stephanie and James. That was a really good presentation. I'm really sorry that we had to start a little bit late, but I think we got through all the questions, which is good.
Okay, you're welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. Have a nice rest of your day and week. And yeah, and please fill out that survey. It should be coming out as soon as this ends. But thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Why is my computer being so bad?